Hello, my name's Gerald Vaisey, and the show is I Can't Write right? As usual, I want to talk you into starting your own story. It's easy to write, and you don't have to write so that somebody else is going to read it even. You just write for your story for yourself, tuck it under the bed, just to get things out of your mind on paper, and you'd be surprised how much fun it is. With me is Charles Brooks. He's written several books. One of my favorites is Greystone Valley. Hi.
Hello.
And how did you come about to start writing?
To start writing in general?
Yes.
Well, when I was a kid, my mother read me a lot of stories, especially the J.R.R. Tolkien Hobbit story, Lord of the Rings stories as bedtime stories. And then that kind of got me into fantasy literature. As I got into high school, I started playing games related to to fantasy literature, tabletop gaming,
like Dungeons and Dragons.
Like Dungeons and Dragons, yeah. And there was one called Dragon Magazine, where in one editorial they had so if you want to write, here's our submission guidelines. And it had never occurred to me at that point that you could actually make money writing for these guys and just writing about the stuff that I was writing already on my manual typewriter. I was banging away notes about imaginary settings, and so I started submitting to them and went from writing gaming articles to writing fiction, and then in college kind of refined my writing style and have since done a little bit of both.
Wow. Now, I read your book and liked it, and Nancy read it and she liked it too. One thing I liked about it was your way you introduce your characters one at a time, and none of the characters are perfect. That's the thing I like the best, because I have never met anybody that's perfect in my life.
Yeah, the sort of general idea that I had with Greystone Valley, I had kind of a generic fantasy fight the bad guy, save the day type of story in mind. And then I wanted to write it specifically about a younger female character, so I came up with Sarah, who's a 12-year-old girl from our world who gets pulled into a fantasy world. She's named after my wife.
Oh.
And she, I guess, is the closest thing to a perfect character that the story has. Although she still has her struggles. She just lost her father. She's dealing with a bit of depression and learning that she has to get out of her own head and interact with other people to get over it. And then for everyone else, I wanted to take kind of the generic fantasy archetypes. So I had a warrior, a wizard, and a dragon. And then I just took one thing that would make them the worst possible thing at what they do. So the dragon is mouse-sized, the wizard cannot read a spell book, the warrior cannot stand the sight of blood, and somehow they muddle through the story anyway and help Sarah along the way.
And then once they get together as a group, they stay together as a group.
Yeah, and they make themselves better. They encourage each other. With Sarah's help, Kay the wizard learns to read his spell book a little bit, just a little bit. And Dax, because there are people relying on him, figures a way past his fear of blood. So both Greystone Valley and the sequel that I wrote, Conquest of Greystone Valley, if there's a theme between them, it would be about friendship. And these people are all flawed people, and they all need help. And because they're friends and they stick together, they help each other, and they make each other better.
Oh yeah, yeah. I like some of you get this little teeny mouse-sized dragon flying around, and nobody can catch it because it's fast. It doesn't have a great big huge ball of fire, but it's enough to startle people. And you say you got a second sequel to it, so you did that just based on the first one, or you?
Well, I was lucky enough with my first one to have I've done both traditional publisher and self-published published novels, and with Greystone Valley, I was lucky enough to land a very good publisher in Grey Gecko Press, and they worked with me. They found a terrific cover artist for the art, which it was the first cover artist they showed me was just perfect for the style of the story.
Oh,
And they've been very helpful, and they gave me some very good editing tips, and I had the good fortune of them asking me if I was writing a sequel, which I had been kicking around an idea for a sequel about a few months after, about 8 months after the Greystone Valley came out. I wrote the first chapter of a sequel as a Christmas present to my wife,
oh,
and had kind of some vague ideas. But then they asked, when they actually asked, then I'm like, okay, well, if this is an implication that it's going to get print, then yes, I will go ahead and I'll write the sequel. And so I took the ideas that I'd been kicking around and fleshed them out. And again, got a lot of help from them in the editing process, and I'm pretty proud of the sequel.
wow, yeah, I'm gonna have to get that one and look at it myself, because the first one was really interesting. The second one's got to be just as interesting. Now, what would your advice be to someone who, well, okay, I think I got a story in my head, I might want to write it, might not, how do I go about doing it? How would you suggest?
You can go ahead and write it down. I have kind of like two sorts of stories that I write. I write, there's the stories that I just have kind of a vague idea and I just start writing, and eventually I have a rough draft that I can go back and revisit. Once you have it written down, then you can go back and you can fine tune it, or you can just, if you don't like it, you can just leave it where it is. It's not doing any harm to anyone written down. The other type of story that I have is when I have kind of a vague idea that I'm kicking around my head, and I don't know if I want to write it down, but I keep it in the back of my head for 6 months or a year, and then eventually decide, yeah, okay, I'll go ahead and write it down. The flaw with keeping it in my head and not writing it down right away is that sometimes I forget.
Yes, yes.
And versus when I write it down, first of all, when you write something down, then the writing process itself gets you going. You find out in the middle of a sentence, oh, maybe I want to change things a little bit. And the story itself changes quite a bit from where you wind up. Greystone Valley started out as initially it was just Sarah was a character in this fantasy setting. It was a very traditional chosen one story. She had like a spider tattoo on her hand that was going to play into a plot later on, and that just felt very, very generic. But when I started writing it down, then she became a person in our world, pulled into a fantasy world. The conflict in her character was her father had died, and so okay, now she has to deal with that. The characters I introduced each of them with, I had kind of a vague idea of what they wanted, what I wanted them to be, and then when I wrote them down, they became more fleshed out and more interesting. And then there are some entire scenes that didn't exist in my head until I wrote them down, until I got into the flow of the story. So if you've got a story in your head, my big suggestion would be to write it down. You can just kind of keep it there with the plan to write it down later, but there's always the risk that it will go away.
Yeah, I talked to a lot of writers, and the waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning with an idea or a story, and then, I'm too tired, and it goes away, or keeping something next to the bed to write it on, and you just write a bit of it, and then when you go back and read it, you say, oh yeah, I can add this and I can do that to it, but if you don't. And how did you started out on an old manual bang it out typewriter?
Yeah,
That's got to be fun when you're trying to edit.
Oh yeah, I grew up in a poor house. We did not have a computer until I bought one I saved up my money until my senior year of high school. I bought a computer. But I had a typewriter, I can't remember it was a large blue typewriter. It had kind of, if you locked it in kind of a suitcase to carry it around. And I had two spools of ribbon, and tried a thing of whiteout next to me, so I would dab the whiteout on it. At one point I tried, there was special paper you could get where if you made a mistake you could erase it and then go back. The problem with that is that then you had letters jumping. It was, but yeah, that is the way I started writing. The first manuscripts that I sent off to a publisher were manually typed with little scratch notes on them and blobs of whiteout where I made a typo. The very first manuscript that I wrote and sent out got lost.
Oh.
And I had to, they accepted this, and I had to completely rewrite the manuscript, and it taught me to make sure I keep photocopies of everything. So for years I had a large box full of old of photocopied manuscripts. Now I'm lucky enough to have a computer, so I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, you can do you can do little sections, and then if this section doesn't fit in this story, you could probably put it into that story with,
Yep,
you know, Control X, Control V,
that's right.
right through. So, as far as you're concerned, you just start writing, and then, like you say, it doesn't matter what you write on. Have you ever seen anybody send a manuscript in? It was just handwritten, not on a computer or typewriter or not anything, or they just don't like that?
Well, I'm sure that some people have done it. I have never sent in a manuscript for publication. I have handwritten letters that I sent in as letters to the editors back before I had a computer and before email was really much of a thing.
Yeah.
One of the things that I would I actually for a while I had a big spiral-bound notebook that first, when I was writing a manuscript, first I would write it out by hand, and then I would write it on a computer. That actually turned out to be very useful because, you know, I would be able to write a scene and then take what I had written. So the actual writing on the computer went fast, but I would catch errors. I would reword things, and it's a second look through. The more opportunity you have to reread something that you've written and revise it, the more polished it's probably going to be.
Now, what's it like? You said you started out the first one self-published, and then you went to Greystone. Or
my first book was Shadow Slayers, which is a fantasy story, and that one was published through a traditional publisher. Unfortunately, the traditional publisher was a very shady operation and kind of took advantage of its authors. They tried to cheat me out of my royalties, and they wound up folding because the owner was indicted for fraud. So it was a very interesting experience. My second book, Reality Check, I decided that was going to be self-published, and the advantage of that is that I got complete control over the manuscript. The disadvantage is that maybe there was some, having an extra set of eyes on it really helps kind of bring the novel out, let it grow a little bit.
So when you self-publish, you just write it all yourself? And
write it all myself, edit all my wife helped with the editing, but it's written by myself, edited by myself. My wife put together the cover for me using some Photoshop and some art directions that I gave her, and unfortunately also promoted all myself. So any bookstore I wanted it to get in, any library I wanted to get in, anywhere that I wanted to advertise, I had to do all the legwork for that. Mm-hmm. With Greystone Valley, it was accepted by Grey Gecko Press, and initially I was kind of hesitant because of my experience with Shadow Slayers earlier, with the thought, any club that would have me as a member, I don't know if I want to be a part of. And then I went online, I did some research on them. I talked in person with the publisher a little bit, and I was assured that these guys seemed to be on the up and up. And I went into it, and they turned out to be extremely useful. There were some plot points in Greystone Valley. Specifically, there's a warlord named Balin. He has a magical sword. That whole bit was specifically suggested by the editors. The sequel, Conquest of Greystone Valley, the ending was there was a bit of an issue with where the ending wasn't really working for one of the editors. They suggested, well, is there a way we could rework this? And I went back to the drawing board, and I really loved the ending the way it turned out. They didn't rewrite the ending; they just suggested a new direction it could go in, mm-hmm. and it made the book stronger.
Which way is if my people out there are writing, from a financial point of view, which one is best financially? Or is it just sort of a toss-up?
It's very narrowly, I would say, the traditional publisher is probably a little more financially viable, unless you just want your book in print and you just want to be able to hand out to a few friends, because the traditional publisher does have a few resources able to help promote it, and I guess you get more royalties through self-publishing, although a lot of those royalties go back into the cost of making the book and the cost of distributing the book. If you are very lucky, which I have not been yet, but who knows, the best way to go is to get an agent, which is very difficult to do, but basically an agent is a guy who knows the publishing industry and can get your book in front of major publishers like Penguin Books or other folks that will get a wide distribution for it. That is very difficult to do. If you land an agent that is reputable, that is a very, very good sign.
I see. So just get your books done, get them out there, and get the experience, and then the first book sounds to me like it's the hardest one because you don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of two components to writing. There's the writing part, which you should do whether you want to publish it or not, because writing is very, very good creatively, is very good therapeutically, and there's nothing wrong with writing something for yourself and a few friends, or just for yourself, and keeping it there. And then there's the publishing aspect, where you definitely want a wide audience to read this, and that's where getting an agent, getting a publisher can be helpful. It's also good if you're planning on being a published author to develop a very good thick skin. Shadow Slayers again was published by Porttown Publishing. The way I got to Porttown Publishing is I picked up a book called The Writer's Market, which is a listing of all the agents and all the publishers out there. And I went through all the agents, and then I went through the publishers, and I went through A, B, C, D, all the way down to P, at which point at P I finally got accepted. Everyone else had rejected me. So
you're going to get file cabinets full of rejections.
Yeah.
Now, what do you send in when you find A publisher and then B publisher. What do you normally send in to entice them to publish for you?
You check the publisher's website. They usually have a submissions section. First, you check see if that they're taking submissions. Some of them don't.
Yeah, I know. Gray Gecko stopped taking submissions.
Yeah, right now they've got a full schedule, so they'll reopen it at some point, I imagine. But right now they've got their folks. If they're taking submissions, then they'll usually tell you whether they want a query letter, which is where you have to basically take your novel and give them one really good paragraph explaining the novel, give them a paragraph explaining your credentials, even if it's writing, I've written to the St. Albans Messenger in the letters to the editor section. That's a writing credit. And then your contact information. The query letter, basically you want to get that as polished as possible because that's very often the one thing that a publisher will see. Some of them will ask for a small sample, 1 to 3 chapters. A lot of them will look at the query letter, and then if they like the concept that you've pitched, they'll send you like, okay, give me X number of pages, give me the first 50 pages. You send that in, and if they like that, then give me more. Each step is a step forward, and but none of that you never reach an ending until the actual manuscript has been accepted. I've gone with an agent at one point through the query letter, through the sample. They read my entire manuscript. They liked my entire manuscript, but they didn't think it was going to sell, so they said no. So it's
like you say, thick skin.
Yeah, and luckily, most people who are going to be writing, a lot of times rejections are not personal. It's not you're not a good writer. It's we don't think this is going to be the right fit for our outfit, or we don't think it's going to sell in the market that we target.
A little salve on the wound, in other words.
Yeah, very rarely is it you're just a bad writer. It's and sometimes it's just we have a million good writers and we have to go and just take and these guys are rolling the dice too. I mean the folks who accepted J.K. Rowling went through a dozen or so rejections before she published the first Harry Potter book. It's not like she was a bad writer and the agents just didn't think it was going to sell, and one person saw something that other people didn't.
I see.
most editors and most agents, if they turn you down, will give you either a form letter, or if you're lucky, a form letter with a little like, great story, try again, which is, if it's a handwritten note, it's gold.
Oh, I didn't know that.
If they wrote anything other than a form letter, it's gold, because it means that they actually took the time. They send out thousands of these things. If they took the time to write you a note, that's gold, and you should save that. But I've only on a very couple occasions had somebody who was unprofessional enough to say, no, this is just terrible. Just one person said, you're wasting my time and yours. To which I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to waste my time and yours anymore, and I'll submit elsewhere.
Now, it sounds to me, from everything that I know and everything I've done in my decades being on Earth, that every failure is a learning event. If you take a failure as a failure, I don't care if you swing at a baseball or try anything in the world, and you take it as a learning experience and you go back and say, okay, what could I have improved upon? You stand a really good chance. But it sounds like by the time you got down to P, you'd done an awful lot of learning experiences.
Oh, yes. And I had rewritten my manuscript a couple times. With one of my books, with Reality Check, before I decided to go the self-published route, I submitted that around a little bit and gotten some feedback. And one person really liked the story, and they said, okay, well, but the thing is, it doesn't feel like a science fiction story. It needs a little more world building around it. So then I went back to the drawing board, and I rewrote a few chapters, and I tried to establish what the setting was and what made the setting different than our world. So even the rejections have been very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like there was explained to me once that aircraft on autopilot gets 10,000 corrections in a minute from the autopilot to the controls, and the airplane doesn't care, it just corrects. And I think writing would be the same way. Like you say, oh yeah, I needed a little world building in there, I needed a little this. And when you got down to Greystone Valley, you'd done the corrections, and it worked.
Yeah, I try not to look back at my books too much, but like, if compared with Shadow Slayers, which is my first book, to Greystone Valley is a much more polished, much more developed product. Partly because I've learned a lot as a writer, and partly because the rejections and the criticisms I've gotten have helped improve my writing style.
So rejections are a good thing.
They're
as long as you take them right.
Yeah, they're not desirable things, but they are a good thing.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, it's yeah. They don't step there. There's little brown stuff on the ground. That's good. Now, what age group were you working for when you did Greystone Valley?
I wasn't working for any specific age group. I had a set of novels that I was kind of inspired by, Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Prydain, and I kind of wanted to write something that felt like that. When the publisher picked me up, then I talked with the editor, and they said, we think this will sell really well between girls aged 10 to 14. So that's how, and with the sequel, I similarly I didn't write for an age group. I reread Greystone Valley so I could get in that same feel. It's marketed toward the same age group, but I just wrote.
You just wrote?
Yeah, I just wrote, and the benefit of having a publisher is that the publisher will tell you where it's going to sell.
It's true. And then even if they don't market it, they still liable to tell you enough so you have some idea of whether you're on the mark or not. We got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to let you give me all the advice I'm going to need. This is the one that you were talking about when you said just hand it to a few friends. I went down to a publishing place in Burlington that for like about $20 a book, they made nice Christmas presents. And if you give your family a book you wrote for Christmas, they can't complain. And you're buying a pretty good thing for $20. So what advice do you have for new writers to, okay, get off the couch and quit slouching around and start writing something?
I would say form good habits. It's like most behavior changes and most improvements come from having good habits. You exercise X number of times a week. You eat, certain foods that you know are good for you. So with writing, you don't have to necessarily write every day, but it really helps to set some time aside where it's like, I'm going to write. And even if you don't have anything in your head, just write down anything. Because the process of writing and the process of thinking about your writing gets your brain thinking along those lines. It forms good habits. You write something, you go back and read it. It's not very good, but then you can see where your problems lie. When you start writing again the next day, then you start thinking about those even subconsciously, and you get in good habits.
Somebody told me that writing things down longhand. Like when I went to college, she said, for the first 5 minutes of class, you just write something. And she thought that was a very good way to write because that frees a part of your mind you don't normally use.
Yep.
Does that work the same way for you?
Yeah, I would say there are many, many days where I don't really feel like writing, and I'm like, okay, well, I have to. I'm obligating myself to. And I get like 2 sentences in, and then all of a sudden start getting carried away, and then an hour passes, and I've written 10 pages. Once you get your brain, on a roll, it's just a matter of, same thing as exercise. Is you can find a million excuses not to exercise. When you get in the habit of exercising, you just sort of get going. Okay.
Well, we got to wrap up, and I've been thrilled to talk to you. I really did love your book. Then we went looking around trying to figure out who the characters were. Nancy found some blurbs on the computer, I guess you Googled it or something like that.
On my website, chbrooks.com.
Yeah, and so I guess we're just about done here, except for write.
Right.
It doesn't matter what you write. If you're depressed, it's a good time to write about your depression, and it'll go away. You don't have to give it to anybody. Just go ahead and write. And so thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And I hope you've inspired somebody else to write as well. And it would be great if they wrote as good as you, but if they don't, that's still great too.
Terrific.
Thank you. And check us out on TV. And I have I Can't Write shows on YouTube. So you want to see somebody else's that's as well, just go on and take a look. And thank you very much.